Today we're going to talk about logic, and we're also going to lead a little into the next lecture, which is the idea of syllogisms. And before you worry too much about a difficult term or you feel like you're moving into your math class, there are a lot of parallels between English and math, if you can believe that. So let's first start with logic. So think back to geometry and proofs. I know some of you are groaning right now, but here's the deal. There are three fundamental principles of logic, and as you can see right there on the screen in front of us. First is the principle of identity. If a statement is true, then it is true. If a statement is false, then it is false. It cannot be both. That is the principle of non-contradiction. A statement cannot be both true and false. Think about your testing. Every time you take a test, the ACT or the SAT or an AP exam or something like that, where you have a multiple choice example or a true-false example, and you have a clause that is true, and then you, on the back side of it, you have a clause that is false. While one part is true, the rest of it negates all of that. So ultimately, the principle of identity holds fast in that regard, as does the principle of non-contradiction. Now, the difficult one is the principle of the excluded middle. This is when a statement is neither true nor false, or a statement is either true or false. There's no middle ground for something to become true or false. So, for instance, if I say planting seeds in April will lead to flowers, that's true if we're planting flower seeds. But I'm excluding a lot of information there, so I have to decide whether it's either true or false. And so part of it may be true, but I'm leaving out a whole wealth of information, and this is what happens when we get into syllogisms. So logic is logical. Okay, if it's true, then it's true. If it's false, then it's false. If it can't be both true and false, and we have to determine based on the context and based on the information provided whether a statement is true or false. And if a lot of information has been left out, that might be difficult to determine, so we may need more information. So I have an example there. The King of France is bald. The King of France may very well be bald. But without more context, we don't necessarily know. In the current time, France does not have a king. So it can't be true. You see, so you just have to figure out context. You have to add in information. You have to make sense of what you've been given. And then you have to be thoughtful. And that's how logic works. Logic is really, really important to critical thinking. It's important to deconstructing arguments. It's important to constructing arguments. As you move into more writing, you'll be faced with whether you use a fallacy, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. We'll get to those soon too. Whether you are constructing a logical syllogism, which is a logical pathway, or if you are constructing a devious syllogism. You have choices as the artist in this matter. Okay, so those are the three fundamental principles of logic. I'm just going to do a quick overview of syllogisms because I've only used 3.5 minutes and I might as well make this worth your time. But I'm going to review syllogisms for a while because you do need to think about syllogisms in terms of the 3 lectures that are constructed in Abolition of Man. But as I mentioned, they're readily apparent in Candide, where they are absolutely devious and illogical. Pangloss is the master of illogical syllogisms. So here again, I mentioned that English and math are often parallel in many ways. You can think about syllogisms in kind of an algebraic construct, A plus B equals C. That's my favorite equation when it comes to English because you can use that for creating thesis statements as well. So your first part of your thesis, your second part of your thesis equals something else. So you're examining 2 primary components in your thesis, which is your claim or major premise, which leads to a result or a consequence or a delivery of some sort. So a syllogism, as you can see in front of us, is the construct of a logical pathway, but it's not necessarily the result of, or the conclusion, it's not necessarily a result of the logic of the conclusion, So we can say A plus B equals X, and we might logically get there, but it may take us a while. And ultimately, we are excluding our middle if we make a construction like A plus B equals X. Now, I may have lost some of you, and you may be thinking, what the heck is she talking about? Just hold fast, because I'm going to review this for sure, because this does require a little bit of play. So, in other words, a syllogism is a logical pathway. Think of it as a train, and it's on a track, and it is moving to a destination. If suddenly that track breaks off and falls off, like in Back to the Future, what we have constructed is an illogical conclusion because our result is something that we didn't anticipate. So let me go directly to the words here. If we have our logical pathway, even if our conclusion is absolutely ridiculous, if it's a logical pathway, we can get there. Now, we know on a train track, if the train track is not completed, we're going to fall off the train track if we use it. Logically speaking, one must question, why are we on that track in the first place? Do you see where I'm going with this? It may have confused you. I may have confused myself with my examples, but let's get back to the notes. So I'll reread it. In other words, if the syllogism is set up as a logical pathway, even if the conclusion is ridiculous, the syllogism is technically logical. It is when the pathway skews that the conclusion becomes wonky. So you can purposely hide logic in the way you pose your syllogism, like we see in Candide. The best example is when Pangloss goes through that entire construction of events where he says, without syphilis, we wouldn't have chocolate. What the heck is he talking about? Well, he's constructed an illogical syllogism. He's hiding his logic in his pathway. For him, it reaches this ridiculous conclusion that makes sense. For us, it makes zero sense. So what you have to understand is we've got several components. We go back to the A, B, and C. We have a major premise, a minor premise, and a resulting conclusion. And those are the numbered pieces there to help you understand. So a stated assumption is a premise, which is also the first element that you must uncover when reading an argumentative essay or when you're writing one, when you are constructing them. That should basically be your thesis or your claim. A syllogism itself is a type of logic in which a major premise followed by a minor premise produces a conclusion. If we talk about global warming, we can say that we're seeing results from various behaviors and activities over time, which will result in ultimately this scenario. Okay, so we have to think about how we follow that logic. Each of us follows logic a little bit differently. But if we go back to the three fundamental principles, we can recognize that there are absolutes about logic, even if we all kind of come at them from different perspectives. Okay, syllogisms generally use the process of deduction to get to clarity, and deduction is a process wherein a conclusion is taken to be true because the statements on which it is true, on which it is based, are true. Okay, so Sherlock Holmes uses deduction to get from a variety of things down to one conclusion. False syllogisms tend to employ a misleading application of this logic, and therefore they actually go backwards. So we have one piece that leads to a general conclusion. So on the surface, the arguments are true, but the conclusion is false, creating an invalid argument. Often these rely on the inductive logic instead, and induction is generally, not always, but generally, because there's definitely value in using inductive logic, but induction in writing relies on inartistic appeals using specific evidence to make a general claim. So evidence often comes in the forms of facts, statistics, reports, testimonies, interviews, and other evidentiary modes to support a claim or proposition. And these may include empirical claims, which is evidence based on observation and experiment. But what you'll find frequently with these types of inartistic appeals is that the statistics are misread or misinterpreted or skewed in some way. So I could say that 100% of lives end in death, which is my favorite statistic ever because it's the most obvious. And who would I cite? But if I'm a savvy arguer and I want to dupe my audience, that is a great statistic to toss out there because it takes people a second to say, you're right. 100% of lives do end in death. Okay, sure. And that kind of builds this relationship, which is kind of an interesting topic and yet another discussion for later. Okay, so we talked recently about how Aristotle suggested that the best arguments employ relatively equally a nice combination of logos, ethos, and pathos. Aristotle also is kind of the father of logical argument, and so he also suggested that every argument could be reduced to two basic parts, which include a statement plus proof. So again, geometry, right? So you have your claim and you have your evidence. We have very little evidence to prove that life can be extended eternally. Let's just talk about the physical right there, okay? Although they did find a shark that's almost 500 years old. He was alive during Shakespeare's time. That's as close to eternal as I can get. Anyway, we'll do more on syllogisms another time, very soon, all right? So I hope that this helps. If you have questions, bring them to class, send me an email, shoot me a text, all right? Smash that like and subscribe button. Talk to you soon. Bye, guys.